You notice too much because silence strips people bare. While others listen for words, you read hesitation, envy, weakness, and threat. That vision isolates you because truth is rarely social. Most men misread silence because they were trained to fear it. They enter a quiet room and call it calm. They sit across from a still face and assume safety. They hear no accusation, no argument, no visible conflict, and they relax like prey grazing at the edge of a dark forest. That is their first error. Silence is never empty. Silence is revelation without narration. Noise protects people. Words blur intention. Explanations act like smoke on a battlefield. The louder someone speaks, the more material they throw between you and what they are. But silence removes decoration. It strips performance from the body. It exposes timing, restraint, discomfort, calculation. When language retreats, motive begins to leak through posture, eyes, hesitation, breath, and rhythm. Silence is not the absence of truth. It is the room where truth stops wearing makeup. That is why weak men cannot remain inside it for long. Silence forces contact with what they spend their lives avoiding. It denies them the narcotic of chatter. It removes the little fictions that keep them functioning socially. In silence, they cannot hide behind charisma, humor, moral slogans, or rehearsed intelligence. They are left with structure, and structure reveals rank. This is the lens shift. Silence is not peace. Silence is exposure. It is the operating table. Under its light, every person begins to open, not with confession, but with fracture. The insecure start filling space too fast. The deceptive become overly deliberate. The needy begin fishing for reassurance. The dominant do something else entirely. They conserve motion. They do not rush to explain themselves because they understand a principle most men never learn. The one who can remain still while others unravel is usually the one controlling the frame. That is the burden of seeing too much. Once you understand silence correctly, you can no longer sit inside it innocently. You begin to notice things other people are too sedated to detect. A delayed answer, a smile that arrives half a second late, a jaw tightening at another man's success, a tone that looks respectful on the surface but carries concealed resentment underneath. You begin to see that most interactions are not conversations. They are negotiations of power disguised as politeness. And once you see that, something dies. The childish version of the world collapses first. You stop believing that people mean exactly what they say. You stop assuming warmth equals loyalty. You stop confusing emotional expression with truth. You realize that many people speak to manage perception, not to reveal intention. Their words are not windows, they are curtains. Silence, however, is harder to fake. It corner cuts, it bypasses script. It shows you who is uncomfortable, who is calculating, who is starving for approval, who is testing boundaries, who wants access, who wants submission, and who is measuring you for weakness. Most men do not want this vision. They claim they want truth, but what they really want is comfort with a moral costume. Truth is expensive. It costs belonging. It costs ease. It costs the pleasant illusion that everyone is roughly sincere. The moment you begin to read silence accurately, social life changes flavor. Rooms become maps, faces become reports, pauses become evidence. You are no longer merely present, you are decoding. That is why perception becomes a burden before it becomes a weapon. First, it isolates you. First, it makes ordinary conversation feel theatrical. First, it forces you to realize how much of human behavior is driven by hunger, fear, vanity, and concealed competition. Only later, if you are disciplined, does that perception become useful. Only later do you learn to hold it without becoming bitter, paranoid, or impulsive. For now, understand the first law. Silence does not comfort the strong. It reveals the structure beneath the performance, and the man who can read that structure has already crossed a border that most will never approach. He is no longer listening for words, he is listening for power. Seeing too much is not a gift. It begins as a wound that learns to wear armor. Most people think perception is a talent, as if some men are simply born more observant than others. That is a child's explanation. Real perception is usually forged under pressure. It comes from repeated exposure to contradiction, when words said one thing, but outcomes said another. When affection carried conditions, when praise concealed envy, when loyalty dissolved under convenience. After enough of that, the mind changes its function. It stops receiving the world at face value. It begins scanning beneath it. That is the mechanism. The average man listens to content. He hears the sentence, reacts to the surface, and moves on. But the man shaped by pressure listens to layers. He tracks the sentence, the timing, the omission, the emotional angle, the hidden incentive. He notices what was said, what was avoided, what shifted, and what that shift protected. This is no longer casual awareness. This is pattern recognition under tension. The problem is that once the machine turns on, it does not shut off easily. You stop entering rooms as a participant, you enter them like a sentry. Every interaction becomes a landscape to read. Every smile gets tested. Every compliment gets weighed. Every silence gets examined for what it contains. You begin to measure people by inconsistency, not presentation. That is why this burden feels so heavy. You are not merely living anymore. You are continuously processing. And processing has a cost. The mind that scans too often loses the luxury of innocence. Rest becomes difficult because perception keeps moving even when the body is still. You notice tension in voices, shifts in loyalty, concealed status games, subtle humiliations, weak attempts at dominance. You begin to see how often human beings posture, bait, deflect, submit, provoke, and disguise. None of it is dramatic in the cinematic sense. Most of it is microscopic. But that is precisely what makes it exhausting. The war is not always loud. Often it is cellular. This is where many men make their second mistake. They confuse hypervigilance with mastery. It is not mastery. A blade shaking in a man's hand is still a blade, but it is not yet under command. In the same way, perception without control is not power. It is exposure to too much information without hierarchy. Everything feels significant. Every detail demands attention. Every inconsistency feels like a warning. The result is not sovereignty. The result is inner congestion. That is why some men who see through people become unstable. They are not broken because they noticed too much. They are broken because they assigned equal weight to everything they noticed. They never learned selection. They never learned which signals matter, which patterns repeat, and which disturbances are simply noise. They turned awareness into a flood and then drowned inside their own conclusions. A strategist does not do that. A strategist knows that perception must be ranked. Not every lie matters. Not every weakness deserves a response. Not every hidden motive threatens you. To see clearly, you must separate the trivial from the structural. The structural is what counts. Who seeks control? Who resents strength? Who leaks under pressure? Who performs virtue for leverage? Who folds when denied attention? Who moves only when watched? Those patterns matter because they predict future behavior. Everything else is dust. This is where the burden sharpens into discipline. You begin to understand that the problem is not that you see too much. The problem is that you have not yet built a throne strong enough to hold what you see. Perception requires containment. Without containment, insight becomes agitation. With containment, insight becomes command. Containment means you do not react to every signal. You let data accumulate. You watch repetition. You wait for patterns to reveal structure. One incident may be mood. 2 may be tension. 3 is architecture. Weak men react to moments, strong men study sequences. That difference alone separates the manipulated from the sovereign. And there is another cruelty buried inside this mechanism. Once you become skilled at reading people, you also begin to see yourself with harsher clarity. You catch your own impulses faster, your own need for validation, your own temptation to explain too much, prove too much, rescue too much, reveal too much. The watcher eventually turns inward, and that is often the most unpleasant stage of all, because now the illusion is gone on both sides. You do not merely see the theater in others, you see the unfinished weakness in yourself. Good. That is where refinement begins. A man who sees manipulation only outside himself becomes paranoid. A man who also detects his own vulnerabilities becomes dangerous in the disciplined sense. He is harder to bait, harder to flatter.
Human beings do not move through the world as equals. They may wear the same clothes, speak the same moral language, and pretend to share the same values, but beneath the surface they sort themselves into types. Not by law, not by title, by instinct, by appetite, by how much reality they can tolerate without collapsing into performance. Most people belong to the first category, the blind. The blind are not stupid in the academic sense. Some are educated, some are articulate, some can quote philosophy, speak about principles, and present themselves with polished confidence. But blindness is not a lack of information, it is a refusal to see structure. These people do not want the real mechanics of human behavior. They want a version of life that lets them function without confronting the brutality underneath it. So they believe what is convenient. They take words at face value. They confuse friendliness with trustworthiness, visibility with value, emotion with honesty, and consensus with truth. They navigate life through permission, not perception. Their main goal is not accuracy, it is comfort. They want the map that makes them feel safe, even if it leads them straight into a trap. The blind are easy to manage because they self-soothe with stories. Tell them what sounds morally acceptable, and they will often ignore what is strategically obvious. Give them a performance with the right emotional costume, and they will mistake it for character. They are not hard to deceive because they lack intelligence. They are hard to save because they are loyal to illusion. Then there is the second category, the performers. The performers are more dangerous than the blind because they know, at least partially, that life is theater. They understand that perception rules outcomes. They know status matters, timing matters, optics matter, and most people can be guided through image more easily than through truth. But instead of using this knowledge to become sovereign, they use it to become adaptive masks. These are the men and women who survive through display. They shapeshift according to audience. They measure rooms quickly, detect what earns approval, then mold themselves to fit that demand. With the powerful, they become respectful. With the weak, they become authoritative. With the insecure, they become reassuring. With the ambitious, they become useful. Their entire identity is tactical, but not in a noble sense. It is not built from principle. It is built from hunger. Performers are exhausting because they are rarely still. They must continuously manage impressions. They cannot afford nakedness. Silence threatens them because it interrupts their control over the narrative. In silence, the costume loosens, their over-explaining begins, their charm becomes too active, their body starts leaking anxiety, they show their dependency on witness. This is why performers often rise socially faster than the blind. They are better at the game, they understand signaling, they understand emotional leverage, they understand how to appear sincere without necessarily being anchored to sincerity. But they remain fragile because their power depends on constant maintenance. Remove the audience, remove the reward, remove the approval stream, and much of their structure caves inward. Then there is the third category, the watchers. The watchers are the men burdened by pattern recognition.
They see beneath interaction, beneath charm, beneath collective delusion. They notice micro-hesitations, inconsistencies, concealed rivalries, silent negotiations of rank. They are less impressed by speech than by tension, less interested in declarations than in behavior under pressure. Their attention moves toward what others miss or avoid. At first, the watcher seems superior to the other two types, and in one sense he is. He is harder to deceive than the blind, and less dependent on display than the performer. But the watcher has his own danger. He can become trapped in observation. He can become a man of perpetual interpretation and insufficient movement. He sees everything, trusts little, and often says less. That can look like strength. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is just caution elevated into identity. The undeveloped watcher lives in mental siege. He studies the room, but never takes the room. He reads motives, but does not always convert that intelligence into position. He knows who is false, who is weak, who is playing status games, who is hungry for access, but knowledge alone does not create command. Without decisive structure, the watcher becomes a ghost in his own life, accurate, isolated, and strategically underused. So understand the distinction. The blind are ruled by appearances. The performers weaponize appearances. The watchers detect what appearances are hiding. But there is a fourth state beyond all three, and that is where this chapter is leading you. The sovereign observer. The sovereign observer is not blind, so he cannot be seduced by surface. He is not a performer, so he does not need constant witness to feel real. He is not merely a watcher, so he does not drown in private analysis. He sees clearly, but he also selects, acts, withholds, positions, and exits with intent. He turns observation into control. That is the evolutionary demand. Because if you remain only a watcher, you will become the man who understands the battlefield, but dies at its edge. There are many such men, sharp, perceptive, psychologically literate, and strategically irrelevant. They can explain every power dynamic after it happens. They can dissect manipulation beautifully. They can identify parasites, weaklings, flatterers, moral actors, opportunists, and covert aggressors with surgical precision, and yet they still lose ground because they never crossed from awareness into rule. This is where the burden becomes selection. Once you see these archetypes, you stop asking naive questions like, is this person good? That is a child's lens. You begin asking harder questions. What drives them? What do they serve? What do they fear losing? Do they pursue comfort, witness, leverage, survival, access, domination? Are they blind because truth would destroy their peace? Are they performing because emptiness demands applause? Are they watching because experience taught them the cost of trusting surfaces? And then, the sharpest question of all, which one are you becoming under pressure? Because all men drift between these states. A man can be blind in love, perform in business, and watch in conflict. Another can watch for years, then start performing once he tastes status. Another can spend his life blind because the pain of seeing would require a full identity burial. These are not fixed labels, they are dominant modes, and your future depends on which mode you feed. If you feed blindness, you will be handled. If you feed performance, you will become hollow. If you feed watching without command, you will become frozen. But if you fuse perception with restraint and action, you become something rarer, difficult to read, difficult to sway, difficult to trap. That's why this chapter matters psychologically. It rips away the fantasy that all people are merely confused versions of the same creature. They are not. They occupy different levels of tolerance for truth. Some need illusion to breathe. Some need attention to exist. Some can see, but not yet rule what they see. Once you accept that, your standards harden. Your expectations become cleaner. Your disappointments become fewer because you stop demanding depth from people built for theater.
And that is one of the coldest freedoms available to a man. Not hating the blind, not envying the performers, not romanticizing the watchers, simply identifying the structure and placing each person where they belong. The man who sees too much is rarely rewarded for it in real time. That is one of the first brutal corrections reality imposes on the intelligent but naive. You grow up assuming that perception will be welcomed, that truth will earn respect, that exposing what is false will strengthen your position. But human beings are not built to reward revelation. They are built to defend psychological stability, and anyone who threatens that stability, especially without permission, becomes a problem. This is not new, it is ancient. Throughout history, the person who sees structure too clearly has always been a social irritant, not because he speaks lies, but because he injures agreed-upon illusions. Courts were built on ceremony, churches on sacred performance, states on public myth, families on selective denial, and communities on emotionally convenient fictions. The man who looks beneath appearance threatens the glue. He exposes the backstage machinery while everyone else is still clapping for the play. And the crowd rarely forgives the man who ruins the performance. This is why many societies have preferred flattering deceivers to uncomfortable perceivers. The deceiver lubricates collective fantasy. He tells people what preserves their self-image. He confirms the costume. He speaks in forms that let the herd continue functioning without fracture. The perceiver does the opposite. He introduces tension. He exposes motives beneath virtue and fear beneath authority. He reminds people that the civilized surface is thinner than they want to admit.
Seeing is not enough. It never was. A man can detect weakness, manipulation, envy, hidden motives, status games, and emotional traps all day long and still remain powerless. Why? Because perception by itself is only intake. It gathers material. It does not shape outcomes. Outcomes change only when what you perceive is governed, ranked, and converted into behavior. That is the pivot of this chapter. Up to this point, perception has been described as burden, exposure, and isolation. Now it must become discipline. If it does not, it will rot into paranoia. And paranoia is simply perception without hierarchy, without restraint, without command. It is when the mind sees signals everywhere but lacks the throne to judge them properly. Everything feels dangerous. Every person feels suspect. Every inconsistency feels loaded with threat. The result is not power. The result is mental servitude to possibility. A paranoid man is not free. He is ruled by what might be. A disciplined man is different. He sees the same world, but he does not kneel to every signal. He does not overreact to shadows. He does not hand equal authority to every discomfort, every pause, every strange tone, every subtle shift in behavior. He filters, he waits, he gathers, he compares. He makes patterns earn their significance before he moves. That is your first strategic correction. Stop reacting to impressions. Start collecting evidence. One strange look means little. One delayed response means little. One awkward interaction means little. Human beings are inconsistent creatures. Fatigue, stress, distraction, ego, shame, hunger, and private conflict all distort behavior. If you assign deep meaning to every fragment, you will become the prisoner of your own interpretive hunger. The disciplined mind does not do that. It watches for repetition. It respects recurrence. It studies what returns under different conditions. Repetition reveals structure. If envy appears once, it may be a moment. If it appears 3 times around your progress, it is character. If someone tests your boundaries once, it may be curiosity. If they do it repeatedly after restraint, it is intent. If respect vanishes the moment you deny access, that was never respect, it was dependence on your compliance. This is how a strategist thinks, not emotionally, structurally. And that leads to the second correction: separate information from intrusion. Not everything you notice deserves access to your nervous system. This is where most perceptive men still behave like amateurs. They notice something false, manipulative, needy, parasitic, or hostile, and immediately their internal climate changes. Tension rises, irritation rises, mental replay begins. They carry the other person's instability into themselves like smugglers of poison. Why? Because they have not yet built the discipline of non-admission. You must learn to see without absorbing. That is not denial, it is containment. It means you can register a person's envy without internalizing it, detect deception without becoming inflamed by it, recognize a power play without feeling compelled to answer it instantly. The immature mind treats every perception like an invasion. The disciplined mind treats perception like data at a border checkpoint, inspected, categorized, admitted, or denied according to usefulness. This one principle alone changes everything. Once you stop absorbing every signal emotionally, your mind becomes quieter. Quieter minds see more accurately. Agitated minds exaggerate. This is why many perceptive people become less accurate the moment they become emotional. Emotion blurs selection. It magnifies the personally offensive and obscures the strategically important. A man insulted by every small deception will miss the larger architecture shaping his environment. So, the rule is simple. Calm is not softness. Calm is clarity under pressure. Now we move to the third correction: convert perception into policy. Weak men rely on mood. Strong men rely on standards. If you must repeatedly analyze the same kind of person, the same kind of trap, the same kind of manipulation, then you are still living without policy. You are forcing yourself to solve old wars from scratch each time they return. That is inefficient, and inefficiency drains sovereignty. Policy means you decide in advance what certain patterns mean for access, trust, time, and exposure. For example, if a person repeatedly gossips about others, you do not keep studying whether they are safe. Policy tells you they are structurally unsafe. Limit depth. If someone only respects boundaries after punishment, policy tells you they are not self-governing. Reduce closeness. If a person becomes cold when they cannot control you, policy tells you they were attached to influence, not connection. Withdraw emotional investment. If someone flatters quickly, extracts subtly, and disappears when denied, policy tells you they are opportunistic. Keep them at transactional distance. This is not cynicism. This is operational intelligence. A kingdom survives through laws, not moods. Your mind must become the same. Otherwise, every manipulator gets multiple fresh opportunities because you keep treating pattern as accident. The fourth correction is harder. Stop explaining your perception to people who benefit from you being confused. This is where many men sabotage themselves. They detect something clearly, then feel compelled to verbalize it too soon. They confront, they overstate, they attempt to force clarity into a person who survives through ambiguity. That is like showing your battle plans to an enemy because you want them to respect your honesty. Foolish. The manipulative rarely surrender when exposed. They adapt, they deny, they reframe, they perform innocence, they recruit witnesses, they turn your language into evidence against you. Why hand them that weapon? Discipline means not every truth becomes speech. Some truths become distance, some become timing, some become a revised access level, some become silence so precise it functions like exile. Strategy is not always verbal. Often, the cleanest response to bad structure is architectural removal. The fifth correction is make your behavior harder to read than your perception. The over-perceptive man has one vulnerability left. His face reveals that he sees. That is a leak. If people can tell when you detect them, they can adjust before their structure is fully visible. They can become careful. They can close their tells. They can begin performing for your gaze. Never give that much away. Develop stillness. Not artificial coldness, not theatrical stoicism. Stillness. The ability to receive information without broadcasting conclusion. Let others wonder whether you noticed. Let them continue. People reveal far more when they believe their first disguise still works. Silence is not only how you read. Silence is how you invite the undisciplined to continue speaking. This is how perception turns into leverage. You no longer chase clarity. You let clarity expose itself. You no longer answer every test. You record the tester. You no longer rush to label people. You let repetition define them. You no longer waste outrage on weak behavior. You simply restructure access. That restructuring is power. And now, the deepest correction of all. Do not let perception become your identity. Many men make a shrine out of seeing. They become addicted to being the one who notices what others miss. They build self-worth around detachment, suspicion, emotional distance, and psychological accuracy. On the surface, this looks sharp. Underneath, it often becomes sterile. Why? Because they stop using perception as a tool and start using it as a personality. The observer becomes so attached to never being naive that he loses flexibility, warmth by choice, and strategic range. That, too, is a trap. A king does not worship his surveillance system. He uses it. The purpose of seeing is not endless diagnosis. It is clean movement, better choices, better boundaries, better timing, better alliances, better exits, better use of silence, better command of self. That is why discipline matters more than perception. Perception can be involuntary. Discipline is chosen. Perception may come from pain. Discipline comes from rule. Perception may burden you with raw awareness. Discipline shapes that awareness into a code strong enough to carry it without collapse. So, what does the disciplined man actually do in practice?
By the end of this transformation, the goal is not to become louder. It is not to become colder for display. It is not to become one more man performing darkness because he was disappointed by human nature. That is amateur theater. Real power is quieter, more selective, more difficult to detect until it is already shaping the room. The final warning is simple. If you see too much but still speak too freely, you will keep donating your advantage to lesser minds. Most men never understand this. The moment they notice something sharp, they rush to announce it. They expose the lie, name the manipulation, reveal the envy, explain the hidden motive, broadcast the pattern. And each time they do, they feel briefly powerful, as if speaking the truth is the same thing as holding power over it. It is not. Usually, it is the opposite. Usually, they have just shown the room where their attention is fixed, what disturbs them, what they know, and how they respond when tension appears. In other words, they have become readable. And readable men are manageable men. The elite rule is different. See clearly, speak rarely. Not because silence is always morally superior, not because mystery is romantic, because speech is expenditure. Every word spends position, every explanation spends structure, every premature truth spends leverage.
If you have spent enough time observing people, then you already know this. The more most people talk, the more of themselves they surrender. Their fear leaks, their need leaks, their resentment leaks, their vanity leaks, their strategy leaks. Even their attempt to appear controlled often leaks the exact insecurity they hoped to conceal. So the final stage is not merely perception, it is sealed perception. You see, but do not always signal. You understand, but do not always reveal understanding. You detect weakness, but do not rush to punish weakness. You notice deception, but do not always interrupt deception. You let patterns mature until action becomes clean, undeniable, and useful. This is what makes your presence begin to feel dangerous. Not aggression, not noise, not performative intimidation. Dangerous in the strategic sense. A person others cannot easily read. A person who does not explain his silence. A person who does not react on schedule. A person who notices more than he says and moves only when movement serves outcome. That kind of person unsettles people because he breaks the rhythm on which manipulation depends. Manipulation needs access, it needs predictability, it needs emotional openings, it needs your compulsion to answer, defend, clarify, confess, rescue, or retaliate. When those reflexes die, your profile changes. You become more difficult to enter, more difficult to provoke, more difficult to classify. You are no longer participating at the speed of everyone else's impulses. You are operating by chosen timing. And chosen timing is one of the cleanest forms of dominance. That is what it means to move like a threat. A threat does not advertise itself continuously. Real threats do not beg to be noticed. They alter behavior through implication, through felt possibility, through the knowledge that careless movement around them may carry consequence. The weak perform intensity because they want immediate recognition. The strong cultivate consequence so deeply that recognition becomes unnecessary. This is why your final evolution requires a ruthless relationship with language. Ask yourself, why are you speaking? To clarify or to soothe discomfort? To expose truth or to relieve pressure in yourself? To create alignment or to force recognition from those unqualified to grant it? To improve your position or simply because silence feels too heavy to carry? Most speech is not strategy, it is discharge. Men reveal because they are burdened by what they know, what they feel, what they noticed, what they fear others might assume. They speak to empty pressure from the chest, but pressure is not always an enemy. Sometimes pressure is stored force. Sometimes the ability to carry unspoken clarity without leakage is exactly what separates the sovereign from the reactive. So the final warning, then, is this: never confuse expression with command. A man who expresses every insight becomes a lecturer in rooms full of tacticians. A man who stores insight, ranks it, and releases only what serves structure becomes something else entirely. He becomes hard to trap, hard to embarrass, hard to outmaneuver. He begins creating an atmosphere around himself, not through theatrics, but through restraint so disciplined that others sense they are standing near someone who is not easily deceived, not easily rattled, and not easily accessed. That atmosphere matters. Because by now you should understand that most battles are won before open conflict. They are won in frame, in expectation, in who appears penetrable and who does not, in who seems available for manipulation and who capable of silent consequences. People test less when the terrain feels costly. Parasites circle wider when the host is difficult to enter. Opportunists become cautious when they cannot easily read appetite, insecurity, or urgency. Controlled silence changes the price of approaching you. That is power without announcement. But do not mistake this for isolation as a religion. Some men hear these ideas and become theatrical hermits, socially rigid, emotionally sterile, suspicious of everyone, incapable of calibrated warmth, incapable of alliance, incapable of measured intimacy. That is not sovereignty. That is damage pretending to be superiority. Remember the standard, not blindness, not performance, not frozen watching, precision, selection, command. You are not becoming less human, you are becoming less available to careless humans. That means your silence is chosen, not defensive. Your distance is measured, not panicked. Your speech is intentional, not compulsive. Your warmth, when given, is governed by standards, not hunger. Your exits are clean because you no longer need the final speech. Your presence carries force because it is no longer leaking itself everywhere. This is the elite threshold the ordinary never reach. Most people live exposed. Their attention is easy to hijack. Their reactions are easy to trigger. Their values are easy to flatter. Their identity is easy to bend because it still depends on witness. They live in chronic self-disclosure, even when silent, through restless behavior, needy explanation, visible resentment, transparent desire. They cannot imagine another way to exist. You can. You can become the man whose quiet is not confusion, but control. The man whose perception is not a burden anymore, but a reserve of force. The man's restraint makes lesser minds uneasy because they cannot map him fast enough to manage him. The man who does not rush to expose because he understands that concealed accuracy often outperforms visible intelligence. And here is the coldest truth of all. Once you truly see clearly, you no longer need to convince anyone that you see clearly. That urge dies. You stop trying to appear wise. You stop trying to be acknowledged as perceptive. You stop needing others to admit you were right. You stop treating each interaction like a courtroom where your reading of reality must be validated. You simply observe, decide, and move. That is the final replacement of identity. The old man wanted answers, recognition, emotional symmetry. The new man wants position, clarity, and freedom of movement. The old man feared being misread. The new man understands that being unreadable is often a form of armor. The old man spoke to prove awareness. The new man lets consequences speak for structure. So this is the closing law. See clearly enough to detect the pattern. Speak rarely enough to preserve the advantage. Move decisively enough that explanation becomes unnecessary. That is how you survive among masks. That is how you keep perception from turning into poison. That is how silence stops being a burden and becomes a weapon. That is how a man leaves the herd without announcing his departure. That is how he becomes difficult to study, difficult to enter, difficult to use. And that is why the final elite standard is not brilliance, it is disciplined opacity. Not everyone deserves access